They say that family is supposed to be your first home, the place where you're loved unconditionally, but Rowan Everhart learned the bitter truth early. When survival is on the line, even blood becomes negotiable. For her parents, the daughter who couldn't shift wasn't a person, she was an asset to be liquidated when the debt came due. And the cruelest part? She'd spent years believing that one day, if she just tried hard enough, she might finally be worth keeping. But worth was measured in claws and fangs, in the ability to run beneath the moon with silver fur rippling. And Rowan had neither. So when King Darius Fenwick's enforcers came to collect, she already knew how the story would end. Hope, she'd discovered, was just another word for the space between who you are and who they wish you were. Hi, my beautiful family. Thank you for sticking around with me through our trying times. I really appreciate your love and support. We're finally back again to give you many more beautiful stories. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The beta's shadow fell across their cottage doorway like a death sentence, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun until the room plunged into premature twilight. Rowan pressed herself against the far wall, her fingers digging into the rough wood as she watched her father, Rowan Everhart, stumble backward, nearly tripping over the threadbare rug. The debt is due, the beta rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Behind him, 2 enforcers flanked the entrance, their eyes glowing amber in the dimness. By order of Lycan King Darius Fenwick, 10,000 silver marks, or the equivalent in collateral. Rowan's mother, Evelyn, made a small, strangled sound. 10,000 marks. They didn't have 10,000 copper pennies, let alone silver. My lord. Garrick's voice shook as badly as his hands. We've had a difficult season. The Northern Territories have been hard on trade, and I didn't come for excuses. The beta's golden eyes swept the room with predatory precision, cataloging everything of value. They lingered on Evelyn, who instinctively shrank behind her husband. The king has been more than patient. 3 extensions, 3 warnings. This is your final notice. Please. Garrick's knees buckled slightly. Everyone in the kingdom knew what happened to those who failed to pay the Lycan King. Some were imprisoned in the obsidian fortress, never to see daylight again. Others simply disappeared. My wife, she's all I have. Give us 1 more month. 1 more month? The beta's laugh was devoid of humor. The king requires payment today. If you cannot provide silver, you will provide service. Service. The word hung in the air like a noose. Rowan's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She knew what came next. She'd known the moment the beta's shadow crossed their threshold. In a world where wolves ruled and strength meant everything, she was the obvious choice. The defective daughter. The one who brought shame to the family name. Garrick's eyes darted around the room, frantic, desperate, and then they landed on her. For just a moment, Rowan thought she saw something that might have been regret, might have been sorrow. But then his face hardened into the same expression she'd seen 1,000 times before. Resignation mixed with barely concealed relief. Take my daughter, Garrick said, his voice steadying now that he'd found his solution. He pointed at Rowan with a trembling finger that grew more confident with each word. She's 20 years old, strong enough to work. She can serve in whatever capacity the king requires. The beta's gaze shifted to Rowan, assessing her with the cold calculation of someone appraising livestock. This one? She has the stench of wolf blood, but... He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. She's dormant, wolfless. Yes, Garrick said quickly, as if this were a selling point rather than a condemnation. But that makes her more manageable, doesn't it? No risk of her going feral or challenging authority. She's obedient, quiet. She knows her place. Each word was a knife between Rowan's ribs. She can't shift, the beta stated flatly. What use is a wolfless girl to the Lycan King? Rowan watched her father's face cycle through emotions, panic, calculation, and then something that looked almost like triumph. She can read, he blurted out, and write, both the common tongue and the old script. She's educated beyond her station. Surely that has some value. The beta tilted his head, considering. The king does maintain extensive archives, and she's never been claimed. Garrick pressed on, desperation making him shameless. No mate, no ties. She's completely unattached. You can take her right now, and there'll be no complications. No pact disputes. Nothing. Asterisk. No loss to anyone. Asterisk. Rowan thought with crystalline clarity. Asterisk. That's what he's not saying. Taking me costs them nothing. Asterisk. Her mother hadn't said a single word. Hadn't even looked at her. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her face pale but carefully neutral. Silent agreement. Very well. The beta gestured to one of his enforcers. The girl will be taken to the Obsidian Fortress. Whether King Darius finds her useful or not is his concern. Your debt will be considered satisfied. The enforcer moved toward Rowan with silver shackles gleaming in his hands. She didn't resist as the cold metal closed around her wrists. What would be the point? Where would she run? This was her family's choice. Their solution? Their salvation bought with her freedom. Wait. Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. For one absurd moment, Rowan felt something flutter in her chest. Asterisk. Maybe asterisk. Evelyn hurried to the small trunk by the hearth and pulled out a faded shawl. She approached Rowan, not meeting her eyes, and draped it around her shoulders. It gets cold in the mountains, she said, adjusting the fabric with shaking hands. The fortress it's very high up. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even kindness. It was permission for Evelyn to tell herself she'd done something times for her daughter in the end. Thank you, Mother, Rowan said softly, and meant it as the goodbye it was. As the enforcers led her toward the door, Garrett called out, You'll be fine, Rowan. You've always been resilient. And who knows? His voice took on a desperately optimistic tone that made her stomach turn. Perhaps the king will find you valuable. Perhaps this is an opportunity. An opportunity. That's what they would tell themselves. That they'd given her a chance at a better life rather than selling her to a monster to save their own skins. Rowan looked back one last time as she crossed the threshold. Her mother had already turned away, clutching Garrick's arm. Her father met her gaze for a brief moment, and in his eyes she saw not love or regret, but relief. The burden lifted, the problem solved. She'd spent her whole life trying to be enough for them, trying to compensate for the wolf she couldn't call, the strength she didn't possess, the value she couldn't prove. She'd believed that if she just worked harder, stayed quieter, took up less space, eventually they might look at her the way parents were supposed to look at their children. But blood, it turned out, was only as thick as the money it could buy. The journey to the Obsidian Fortress took 3 days. Rowan rode in a covered wagon with 2 other prisoners, a thief who'd stolen from the king's treasury, and a woman who'd harbored a fugitive. They didn't speak to her. Even among the condemned, wolfless girls were beneath notice. As they climbed higher into the Shadow Peak Mountains, the air grew thin and cold, and Rowan wrapped her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't let herself cry. Tears required the belief that someone cared enough to wipe them away. Instead, she watched the landscape transform from rolling green hills to jagged black stone, from settlements and farmland to wilderness and mist. The fortress appeared on the 3rd evening like something out of a nightmare, a massive structure of obsidian and iron perched on a cliff face, its towers clawing at the sky like talons. Torches burned in the windows, casting an eerie red glow against the darkening sky. Rowan could feel the power emanating from the place, even from a distance, a thrumming vibration in her bones that spoke of ancient magic and barely restrained violence. This was the seat of Lycan King Darius Fenwick, the most feared ruler in 100 generations. They said he was more beast than man, that his curse ran so deep he could barely hold human form, that he'd killed his own father to claim the throne. They said a lot of things about King Darius. None of them were good. The wagon rolled through the massive iron gates, and Rowan felt them close behind her like the final page of a book snapping shut. Whatever came next, whether she found herself in the archives or the dungeons, whether the king deemed her useful or disposable, one thing was certain: she would never go home again. But then, she thought with bitter clarity as the guards dragged her from the wagon, she'd never really had a home to begin with, just the illusion of one, and illusions only hurt when you finally see through them. The beta who'd collected her appeared at the top of the fortress steps, his silhouette massive against the torchlight. "Bring the wolfless girl," he commanded. "The king will see her now." Rowan's shackles clinked as the guards hauled her forward, up the steps and into the mouth of the fortress, into the domain of the monster. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the fear, despite the certainty that she was walking toward her doom somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she thought had gone numb years ago, something whispered, "Asterisk. Maybe monsters understand broken things better than families ever did. Asterisk. The interior of the obsidian fortress was exactly as cold as its exterior promised. Rowan's breath misted in the air as the guards marched her through corridors of polished black stone, their boots echoing against walls carved with ancient runes that seemed to pulse with faint crimson light. She caught glimpses through arched doorways of vast halls filled with lichens in various states of transformation, some fully human, others with wolf ears or claws, a few massive beasts lounging by fireplaces that roared with flames but gave off no warmth. Every eye that landed on her carried the same expression, contempt laced with curiosity, as if she were a strange insect that had wandered into a lion's den. The guards flanking her were no better. They hadn't spoken a word to her since dragging her from the wagon, communicating only through rough shoves and the occasional growl when she didn't move fast enough. Their fingers bit into her arms with casual cruelty, and she knew there would be bruises blooming purple by morning. If she lived to see morning. They passed through a great hall where dozens of Lycans had gathered, their conversations dying to whispers as Rowan was paraded past. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight despite the shackles, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. But she felt their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. "That's the debt payment?" someone muttered, not bothering to lower their voice. "She's barely got any wolf scent on her at all. Defective bloodline," another replied with a sneer. "Look at her. Probably can't even hear the moon's call." A woman's laugh, sharp and cruel. "The king will have her thrown to the beast within the hour." What a waste of a journey. The beast. Rowan had heard whispers of it even in her remote village, something the king kept locked away, something that required fresh meat to keep it satisfied. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep breathing. The beta who'd taken her from her parents appeared at the end of the corridor, his golden eyes gleaming as he watched her approach. He dismissed the guards with a curt gesture and circled her slowly, his footsteps deliberate, assessing. "You understand where you are?" he asked finally, his voice deceptively mild. "The obsidian fortress," Rowan replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Home of Lycan King Darius Fenwick. And do you understand what you are here?" She met his gaze steadily. "Property, payment for a debt my father couldn't honor." Something flickered in his expression, approval or perhaps surprise that she wasn't dissolving into tears. "At least you're realistic. That will serve you better than hope in this place." He gestured down another corridor, darker than the rest. "The king will determine your use. Until then, you'll be kept in the lower chambers. Speak when spoken to, obey without question. And whatever you do, don't wander after dark. The Lycans here have little patience for humans, and even less for wolfless half-breeds." Rowan nodded, though her stomach churned with dread. The beta led her down a spiral staircase that seemed to descend into the mountain itself. The temperature dropped with each step, and the torchlight grew sparse until they were walking through near darkness. Finally, they reached a heavy iron door. He produced a key and unlocked it, revealing a small stone cell with a thin pallet, a bucket, and nothing else. "Someone will fetch you when the king is ready," he said, removing her shackles. The sudden absence of their weight felt strange, like she might float away. "I suggest you rest. You'll need your strength for whatever comes next." The door slammed shut before she could respond, and the lock tumbled into place with a finality that echoed in her bones. Rowan stood in the darkness, listening to his footsteps fade away. Above her, she could hear the muffled sounds of the fortress voices, movement, the occasional howl that made her blood run cold. The Lycan court, living their lives while she waited in the dark to learn her fate. She sank onto the pallet and pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold here wasn't just physical, it was existential. The chill of being utterly alone in a place that saw her as less than nothing. But she'd been alone before. She'd survived being unwanted, unloved, unvalued. She could survive this too. At least, she told herself that as the hours crawled by and the darkness pressed in from all sides, as patient and inevitable as death itself. They came for her at dawn, though Rowan only knew this because the guards told her so. In her cell, there was no difference between midnight and morning, just the same oppressive darkness. 2 female servants appeared with the guards, their expressions hard and efficient, as they hauled her out and marched her through different corridors to a chamber that smelled of lavender and steam. "Strip," the older servant commanded, already filling a copper tub with water that steamed in the cold air. "You're to be presented to the king, and you reek of fear and poverty." Rowan's fingers trembled as she removed her clothes, her skin prickling with humiliation, as both servants watched with undisguised disdain. They scrubbed her raw with brushes that felt like they were taking off skin, along with 3 days of grime, their touches clinical and rough. When she flinched, the younger servant yanked her hair hard enough to make her eyes water. "Hold still. We don't have all day to make you presentable." They dressed her in a simple white shift that felt like a burial shroud, thin enough that she could see the shadow of her body through the fabric. Her hair was combed until it gleamed like moonlight, then left to hang loose down her back. No shoes, no undergarments, nothing but the shift and her own vulnerability. "This way," the older servant said, and led her up a different staircase, wider, grander, lit with torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, hung with tapestries depicting battles between wolves and ancient enemies. They stopped before an enormous door carved with symbols Rowan couldn't read, and the servant knocked 3 times. "Enter." The voice from within was deep, commanding, and sent an instinctive shiver of submission down Rowan's spine. The throne room was vast and brutal in its dark magnificence. Obsidian columns soared toward a ceiling lost in shadow. A massive fireplace roared along one wall, but somehow the room remained cold, and on a throne of black iron and bone sat King Darius Fenwick. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair that fell just past his shoulders, and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruelty carved into every line. He wore black leather and furs, a crown of twisted silver resting on his brow. But it was his eyes that trapped her, golden, predatory, ancient beyond his years. Eyes that had seen centuries of bloodshed and felt nothing. Those eyes raked over her now, assessing her the way one might assess a tool before deciding whether to use it or discard it. "So this is what Rowan Everhart valued his life at," Darius said, his voice carrying an edge of dark amusement. "A wolfless girl in a thin shift. Tell me, debt payment, can you even shift at all? Or are you completely human?" Rowan forced herself to meet his gaze. "I have wolf blood, Your Majesty, but no wolf form. I've never shifted. Defective." Then, he leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "And yet your father insisted you had value. What value could a wolfless half-breed possibly offer me? I can read and write, Your Majesty, both common tongue and old script. I can keep records, manage archives. I have scribes." He stood abruptly, descending from his throne with predatory grace. He circled her slowly, and Rowan fought the urge to turn and track his movement. What else? What else? Her mind raced. "I'm resilient. I learn quickly. I don't require much food or boring." He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell leather and smoke and something wild underneath. "Here's what I see. A girl nobody wanted. A burden her own family sold to save themselves. Someone who's learned to survive by making herself small and useful and utterly forgettable." He tilted his head. "Am I wrong?" The words hit like physical blows, but Rowan kept her voice steady. "No, Your Majesty." Something flickered in his golden eyes, interest perhaps, or surprise that she hadn't crumbled. "Honest, at least. That's rarer than you'd think." He turned away from her, pacing toward the fire. "I have a guest in this fortress. A permanent resident, you might say. He requires companionship, someone to keep him occupied during the long nights." Rowan's blood turned to ice. The beast. They were going to feed her to the beast. "You will be taken to his chambers each evening at sunset," Darius continued, his back still to her. "You will stay with him until dawn. If you survive the first night, you'll return the second. And so on. Your only duty is to keep him from becoming restless. And if I refuse?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Darius turned, and his smile was all fangs. "Then I'll send you back to your father in pieces, and he can try offering me something else to settle his debt. Perhaps your mother this time." He walked back to her, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "But you won't refuse. Because despite everything, you want to live. I can see it in your eyes. That stubborn little spark that hasn't quite gone out." He straightened and gestured to the servants waiting by the door. "Take her to the West Tower, the beast's chambers. And girl," he waited until she met his eyes again. "Try not to scream too loud. It only excites him." The servants dragged her away, and Rowan's last glimpse of the king was of him returning to his throne, already dismissing her from his thoughts as if she were nothing more than a problem solved. The west tower climbed higher than Rowan thought possible, the stairs spiraling up until her legs burned and her breath came in gasps. The servants left her at a door bound with iron and covered in claw marks so deep they'd gouged through the wood to the stone beneath. One of them pressed a key into her hand. "Lock it behind you," the woman said, her face pale. "He can't turn the handle when he's in that form. It's the only thing keeping him contained." Then they fled, their footsteps echoing down the stairs like retreating thunder. Rowan stood alone before the door, the key growing warm in her palm. From inside came sounds: heavy breathing, the scrape of claws against stone, a low rumbling that might have been a growl or might have been something else entirely. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The king had made that abundantly clear. She turned the key and pushed the door open. The chamber was enormous, lit by a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. Furs covered the floor, and chains hung from the walls, some broken, some merely bent. Books were scattered everywhere, stacked in precarious towers and spread open as if someone had been reading multiple volumes at once. But it was the creature by the window that stole her breath. The beast was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with fur as black as midnight, and eyes that glowed amber in the firelight. His form was caught between wolf and man, hunched shoulders packed with muscle, hands tipped with claws that could disembowel her with a single swipe, a muzzle full of fangs that gleamed when he turned his head toward her. The moonlight streaming through the window caught the silver scars crisscrossing his body. Old wounds that spoke of violence survived. He growled, low and warning, and took a step toward her. Rowan's hand shook as she pulled the door shut behind her and locked it. The click of the bolt seemed impossibly loud. She pressed her back against the wood, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The beast moved closer, his massive head lowering to sniff her. His breath was hot against her neck, and she could feel the vibration of his growl through her bones. This was it. This was how she died, torn apart by a monster in a tower, her screams unheard, her body unmourned. But then she noticed something. The beast wasn't attacking. He was waiting, his amber eyes fixed on her face with an intelligence that didn't belong to a mindless animal. There was something almost human in that gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. "Hello," Rowan whispered, her voice breaking on the word. The growling stopped. The beast tilted his head, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. She noticed one of the open books on the floor near his feet, a collection of old legends, the pages worn from repeated reading. Her father had owned a copy once, before he'd sold it along with everything else of value. She'd memorized her favorite passages as a child. "Do you?" She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Do you like stories?" The beast made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a questioning huff. He backed away slightly, settling onto his haunches, still watching her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Rowan took it as permission. She moved slowly, carefully, to the nearest pile of books and selected one at random, a volume of poetry from the Old Kingdom. Her hands trembled as she opened it, but her voice steadied as she began to read. In the time before the moon's first breaking, when wolves ran silver through the ancient wood, the beast's eyes never left her face. As she read, he gradually relaxed, his massive form settling fully onto the furs. The tension in the room shifted, transforming from predatory to something else, something almost peaceful. When she finished one poem, she started another, and then another, her voice growing stronger with each verse. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher in the sky, casting silver patterns across the floor. Rowan's throat grew raw, but she didn't stop. Whenever she paused, the beast would make a small sound, almost plaintive, and she would continue. It was near dawn when her voice finally gave out completely. She set the book aside, her hands aching from holding it so long, and looked at the beast. He'd moved closer during her reading, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the thick fur of his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't read any more tonight." The beast studied her for a long moment, then did something that made her breath catch. He pushed one of the books toward her with his massive paw, a different volume, one with a cracked leather spine and gold lettering. An offering, she realized. A request. "Tomorrow," she promised, her eyes stinging with exhaustion and something she couldn't name. "I'll read this one tomorrow." The beast made a sound that might have been approval, then turned and padded to the far side of the chamber, settling near the fire. But his eyes remained open, watching her, and Rowan understood. He was giving her space, showing her she was safe. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Rowan curled up on the furs near the door, her mother's words echoing in her mind. Asterisk. It gets cold in the mountains. Asterisk. But here, in this chamber with a monster, she felt warmer than she had in her parents' house in years. The beast's breathing eventually evened into sleep, and Rowan closed her eyes, wondering if survival could somehow transform into something more. The guards came for her at dawn, their expressions surprised to find her alive and intact. They escorted her back through the fortress in silence, past Lycans who stopped their conversations to stare at her with open curiosity. The wolfless girl had survived a night with the beast. Apparently, that was noteworthy. They delivered her to a different chamber this time, smaller than the throne room but no less intimidating. King Darius sat at a table laden with food, dressed in dark riding clothes, looking irritatingly well-rested. He gestured to the empty chair across from him without looking up from the reports he was reading. "Sit, eat. You look half dead." Rowan's stomach betrayed her with a loud growl, and she sank into the chair with as much dignity as she could muster. The food was better than anything she'd eaten in months. Warm bread, cheese, meat that actually had flavor. She tried not to devour it like a starving animal, but Darius's amused glance told her she'd failed. "So," he said finally, setting aside his papers and leaning back in his chair, "you survived. I'll admit, I didn't think you would. Most don't last past the first hour." "Most?" Rowan's hand paused halfway to her mouth. The beast has had several companions over the years. None of them particularly enjoyed the experience. His golden eyes studied her with unnerving intensity. "What did you do differently? Beg for your life? Grovel? Or did you simply bore him into submission with endless tears?" The contempt in his voice sparked something hot in Rowan's chest. "I read to him." Darius blinked. Then he laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You read to the beast, to a mindless creature who exists only to destroy and devour. You think that monster understood a single word? He's not mindless," Rowan said before she could stop herself. The king's laughter died abruptly. "Excuse me?" She'd already started. There was no point in backing down now. "The beast isn't mindless. He has books in his chamber, dozens of them, all well worn. Someone has been reading them. And I don't think the servants are climbing those stairs to enjoy poetry." She met his gaze steadily. "He listened to every word I read," he responded. "He even chose the next book he wanted me to read." Darius's expression shifted into something unreadable. "You're defending him." "I'm stating facts, Your Majesty." "Facts." He stood abruptly, circling the table to loom over her. "Here's a fact. Debt payment. That beast is a curse-given form. A monster that should have been put down years ago. He's kept alive because..." He stopped himself, jaw clenching. "Because there are complications. But make no mistake, there's nothing worth saving in that creature." "Then why keep him?" Rowan asked quietly. "If he's truly just a monster, why not end it?" The king's hand slammed down on the table, making the plates rattle. "You dare question me? I'm trying to understand, Your Majesty." She kept her voice calm despite her racing heart. "You speak of him with such hatred, but you give him chambers in your tower, books to read, and now a companion who might actually survive more than a night. That doesn't sound like how one treats a worthless beast." For a long moment, Darius said nothing. His golden eyes bore into hers, searching for something deception, perhaps, or mockery. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. "What else did you notice about him?" Rowan hesitated, sensing she was walking a knife's edge. "He's in pain. The way he moves, the scars covering his body, whatever he is, it hurts him. And he's lonely, desperately lonely. No creature reads that many books, in that many different languages, unless they're trying to escape something unbearable." "Languages," Darius repeated, his expression shifting again. "You noticed he has books in multiple languages. Old Kingdom verse, modern continental, even some northern dialect poetry. He chose the Old Kingdom for me to read next." She paused. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, what is he?" "Because he's not just a beast, and I don't think he's just a curse either." The king turned away from her, walking to the window that overlooked the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was cold enough to frost glass. "That's not your concern. Your concern is keeping him occupied until I decide what to do with you both. And if I fail, if tonight he decides he's had enough of poetry and tears me apart instead, then at least you'll have died being useful for once in your life." He glanced back at her, and something flickered in his expression, regret, perhaps, or recognition, but I don't think he will. Despite everything, the beast seems to have developed a fondness for broken things. The words hung in the air between them, and Rowan wondered if he was talking about the beast or himself. "You'll return to his chambers tonight," Darius said finally. "And every night after, until I say otherwise. Consider yourself fortunate, debt payment. Most slaves in this fortress have far less pleasant duties." The guards appeared to escort her out, but Darius's voice stopped her at the door. "Rowan." It was the first time he'd used her name, and it made her turn back. "Whatever you think you saw in that creature, whatever kindness you believe you found, remember that monsters are called monsters for a reason. Eventually, they all show their teeth." But as the guards led her away, Rowan couldn't help thinking that the only person who'd shown her teeth so far was the king himself. The beast, for all his claws and fangs and monstrous form, had done nothing but listen to her voice in the darkness. And somehow, that made all the difference. The nights blurred together into a pattern that became almost comfortable. Rowan would climb the tower stairs at sunset, unlock the door, and find the beast waiting for her, sometimes by the window, sometimes by the fire, but always with a book already selected. She'd read until her voice grew hoarse, and he'd listen with that unnervingly intelligent focus, occasionally making sounds that she'd learned to interpret. A low rumble meant continue. A softer huff meant slower. A particular tilt of his head meant he wanted her to repeat a passage. They developed a language between them, unspoken but understood. By the third week, Rowan no longer locked the door behind her. The beast had never tried to leave, never showed any desire to escape. If anything, he seemed content in his tower prison as long as she was there to fill the silence with words. By the fourth week, she'd stopped flinching when he moved close to her. His massive form no longer seemed threatening but protective, a wall of fur and muscle between her and the cold stone walls. By the fifth week, she'd caught herself reaching out to touch him just once, her fingers brushing through the thick fur of his shoulder as she read. He'd gone completely still, hardly breathing, and she'd pulled back immediately, mortified. But then he'd leaned into her touch, just slightly, and she'd understood. He was as starved for gentle contact as she was. King Darius questioned her each morning, his interrogations growing shorter but more intense. He watched her with those predatory golden eyes, searching for something she didn't understand. Sometimes he seemed almost angry that she continued to survive, continued to return each night without complaint. Other times, she caught something else in his expression, something that looked almost like longing. Tonight marked 6 weeks since her arrival at the Obsidian Fortress. Rowan climbed the tower stairs with a lightness that would have seemed impossible that first terrifying night. She pushed open the door and stopped short. The beast sat in the center of the chamber, and spread before him on the furs was something that made her breath catch. A necklace ancient and beautiful, wrought from silver so pure it seemed to glow in the firelight. The pendant was a wolf mid-leap, its form captured in exquisite detail, and hanging from it was a moonstone that shifted from blue to silver as she moved closer. "Is this—" She knelt beside him, hardly daring to touch it. "Is this for me?" The beast made a sound deep in his chest, something between a rumble and a whine. He pushed the necklace toward her with one massive paw, then looked away, almost shy. She'd never seen him uncertain before, and it made her heart twist. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting the necklace with trembling hands. "I've never owned anything so lovely." She fastened it around her neck, and the moonstone settled against her skin with a warmth that felt almost alive. When she looked up, the beast was watching her with an intensity that made her shiver. His amber eyes glowed brighter than usual, and his massive chest heaved with breath that seemed labored. Then he spoke. The voice was rough, distorted by his monstrous form, but unmistakably words. "Mine." Rowan's heart stopped. "You can speak. You are mine." Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. He moved closer, his muzzle inches from her face. "Fated. Mate." The moonstone burned against her chest, and suddenly she felt it a pull so strong it nearly staggered her, an invisible thread connecting her to this creature, binding them together in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The fated mate bond. She'd heard stories of it, the sacred connection that transcended choice, that marked two souls as destined for each other. "No," she breathed, stumbling backward. "No, that's not you. Can't be yours," the beast insisted, following her retreat. "You feel it." She did feel it. That was the terrifying part. She felt the rightness of being near him, the way her body calmed in his presence, The inexplicable sense that she belonged here in this tower with a monster, but that didn't make it real. It couldn't be real. "I'm nobody," Rowan said, her voice breaking. "I'm wolfless. Defective. My own parents sold me because I had no value. I can't be anyone's mate, least of all a—" She stopped, but the word hung between them anyway. Asterisk, monster. Asterisk. The beast's eyes dimmed, and he backed away as if she'd struck him. "Not choice. Fate. I don't believe in fate." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced it out anyway. "This bond, this connection, it's just a trick, a curse playing games. You're not even—" Her throat closed around the words. Asterisk. "You're not even human." Asterisk. The beast let out a sound that was unmistakably pain, a howl that shook the windows and made her cover her ears. He turned away from her, his massive form trembling with emotion that had nowhere to go. "I'm sorry," Rowan whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, but I can't. I can't accept this. I can't accept you." The silence that followed was worse than his howl. The beast remained with his back to her, and Rowan could see the rise and fall of his shoulders, could hear the ragged sound of his breathing. She wanted to reach out, to take back the words, but fear had its claws in her throat. What did she know about love, about bonds, about being chosen? Her family had thrown her away. Her worth had been measured and found wanting her entire life. How could she possibly be someone's fated mate? And even if the bond was real, how could she spend her life with a creature who existed only in the darkness, who wore a monster's face? "Leave," the beast said finally, his voice barely audible. "Please, leave." Rowan fled down the tower stairs, the moonstone heavy against her chest, burning like an accusation with every step. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her cell, staring at the darkness, the moonstone still warm against her skin. She tried to remove it a dozen times, but her fingers wouldn't obey. Some part of her, the part connected to that invisible thread, refused to let go. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the sky, Rowan had made her decision. She'd been afraid her entire life. Afraid of disappointing her parents, afraid of being worthless, afraid of taking up space in a world that didn't want her. And where had that fear gotten her? Sold like property, delivered to a monster, alone in the darkness. But the beast had never made her feel worthless. He'd listened to her voice like it was the only sound that mattered. He'd shared his books, his space, his carefully guarded vulnerability. And when he'd offered her the bond, the most precious thing he could give, she'd thrown it back in his face because she was too afraid to believe she could be wanted. No more. Rowan climbed the tower stairs as dawn broke, her heart hammering with equal parts terror and determination. She would go to him. She would accept the bond. She would choose the beast, monster's face and all, because he'd chosen her first. She reached the door and found it already open, just a crack. Strange. The beast always kept it closed until she arrived. She pushed it wider, preparing words of apology, of acceptance, of— The sound stopped her cold. A grinding, breaking, agonized sound that didn't belong to any creature she'd ever heard. She peered through the doorway and her breath left her body. The beast was convulsing on the floor, his massive form writhing in obvious torment. His fur seemed to ripple and retreat, his bones cracking and reforming with sounds that made her stomach turn. He was shrinking, changing, his muzzle shortening, his claws retracting. Dawnlight streamed through the windows, and wherever it touched his body, the transformation accelerated. Rowan pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to look away from the horrifying metamorphosis. This was the curse. This was what happened every dawn. The agony he endured alone because she always left before sunrise. The beast's howls turned to screams, human screams, and Rowan watched in frozen horror as the fur disappeared entirely. As the massive frame condensed into something smaller, something familiar. No, the transformation completed, and the figure on the floor pushed himself up on trembling arms, breathing hard. Dark hair fell across his face, and when he lifted his head, golden eyes met hers through the doorway. King Darius Fenwick. Rowan's legs nearly gave out. The beast was the king. The king was the beast. All those nights, all those conversations, all those moments of connection it had been. Darius, the man who'd mocked her, who'd called her worthless, who'd questioned her every morning while knowing exactly what she'd said to him the night before. "Rowan," Darius said, his voice raw from the transformation. He started to rise, one hand reaching toward her. "Wait, I can explain." She ran. She fled down the stairs so fast she nearly fell, her mind reeling with the betrayal of it all. He'd known. Every morning when he'd questioned her, when he'd mocked the beast, when he'd watched her with those calculating eyes, he'd known. He'd been testing her, playing with her like a cat with a mouse. The fated mate bond, the moonstone, the confession of feeling connected to her, all of it a game, all of it a lie. How dare he make her feel seen, valued, understood, when all along he'd been the same man who'd called her a debt payment and looked at her like she was property. He'd used both his forms to manipulate her, to see if the worthless, wolfless girl would be desperate enough to fall in love with a monster. Rowan burst out of the tower and into the courtyard, startling guards who reached for their weapons. She didn't care. She ran for the gates, for freedom, for anywhere that wasn't here with him. "Stop her!" Darius's voice roared from somewhere above, but Rowan was already through the gates, already disappearing into the forest that surrounded the fortress. The moonstone burned against her chest like a brand, the fated mate bond pulling at her with every step she took away from him. It hurt worse than anything her parents had ever done, worse than being sold, worse than being called worthless. Because for a few brief weeks, she'd allowed herself to hope. She'd let herself believe that something could actually want her, but it had all been a performance. The cruel king and the gentle beast, two sides of the same coin, both of them playing her for a fool. Rowan ran until her legs gave out, until she collapsed in a clearing miles from the fortress. She tore at the moonstone, trying desperately to remove it, but the clasp wouldn't budge. The bond wouldn't release her. She was still connected to him, still tied to the man who'd made her believe in something real, only to reveal it was all just another game. She curled onto her side in the dirt and let herself break, let the sobs tear through her body while the sun climbed higher and the fortress disappeared behind the mountains. She'd survived being unwanted by her family. She'd survived being sold. She'd survived 6 weeks with a monster. But she didn't know if she could survive having her heart broken by the one person who'd made her believe it was worth giving away. The moonstone pulsed against her skin in rhythm with her fractured heart, a constant reminder of the bond she'd almost accepted, the love she'd almost claimed, and the lie it had all turned out to be. 1 year. 365 days since Rowan had fled the obsidian fortress, and still the moonstone burned against her chest. Still the bond pulled at her like a fishhook lodged in her soul. She'd tried everything to remove it. Blacksmiths, hedge witches, even a priest who'd declared the necklace cursed and refused to touch it. The bond wouldn't release her, wouldn't let her forget, wouldn't grant her the mercy of moving on. She'd made a life in the border village of Ashenmere, working in a tavern where no one asked questions about the pale girl with haunted eyes who flinched whenever anyone mentioned the Lycan King. She kept her head down, saved her coins, and tried not to think about golden eyes in 2 different forms, or the sound of a monster's voice saying, "Mine." She failed at that last part every single night. The tavern was crowded tonight, full of merchants and travelers seeking shelter from the autumn storms. Rowan moved between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling ales and dodging wandering hands. She was wiping down a corner table when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. "Wedding is in 3 days, one merchant said, leaning close to his companion. King Darius finally agreed to a political marriage. Lady Cordelia of the Northern Reaches. They say she's got ice in her veins and ambition in her heart. About time he took a wife. Kingdom needs heirs." Rowan's hand stilled on the table. Darius was getting married. Of course he was. Kings needed queens, needed alliances, needed legitimate heirs. The fated mate bond meant nothing compared to political necessity. She told herself she didn't care, told herself it was better this way, told herself the sharp pain in her chest was just indigestion from the stew. "Shame about the assassination plot, though," the first merchant continued, lowering his voice. "You hear about that?" Rowan froze. "What plot?" The second merchant asked, leaning in eagerly. "Keep your voice down. My cousin works in the Northern Reaches household guard. Says Lady Cordelia's brother has been hiring mercenaries, planning to kill the king during the wedding ceremony itself. They're going to..." Rowan's ale pitcher slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Both merchants looked up at her, annoyed, but she barely noticed. Her mind raced, her heart hammering against the moonstone that suddenly blazed with heat. Darius was going to die. Someone was going to kill him at his own wedding, and he probably had no idea. Why would he suspect his bride's family? Political marriages required trust, or at least the appearance of it. She should let it happen. He'd used her, manipulated her, broken her heart. He deserved whatever fate delivered. The kingdom would find a new king, and Rowan could finally be free of this cursed bond. But even as she thought it, she knew it was a lie. Because despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal and pain, the bond wouldn't let her wish him dead. And beneath the bond, beneath the hurt, was the truth she'd been running from for a year. She'd fallen in love with both versions of him. The cruel king who'd seen through her masks, and the gentle beast who'd listened to her voice in the darkness. They were the same person, and she'd fled before letting him explain why. Rowan cleaned up the broken pitcher with shaking hands, her mind already racing ahead. 3 days until the wedding. 2 days of travel to reach the obsidian fortress if she rode hard. It was insane. She was probably wrong about the plot. And even if she wasn't, why would Darius believe her? Why would he even let her through the gates after she'd run away? But the moonstone burned against her chest, and the bond pulled her north with inexorable certainty. She left that night, stealing a horse she promised herself she'd return someday, and riding through the darkness toward the fortress that haunted her dreams. She disguised herself in a merchant's cloak, pulled her hood low, and tried not to think about what she'd say if she actually managed to reach him. The fortress loomed against the mountains exactly as she remembered, dark and imposing, and somehow beautiful in its savage majesty. The wedding preparations were obvious, even from a distance, banners hanging from the towers, guards doubled at every entrance, carriages arriving with noble guests from across the kingdom. Rowan approached the main gate where crowds of petitioners and merchants gathered, all seeking entry for the celebration. She pulled her hood lower and joined the throng, trying to look like she belonged. But as she neared the entrance, she saw him. Darius stood on the battlements above, speaking with his beta. Even from this distance, Rowan could see the tension in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes. He looked thinner than she remembered, harder, like something essential had been carved out of him. The moonstone flared with heat, and Darius's head snapped up as if he'd heard a sound. His golden eyes scanned the crowd below, searching, and Rowan's breath caught. Could he feel her through the bond? Did it pull at him the way it pulled at her? Their eyes met across the distance, and the world stopped. For one endless moment, they simply stared at each other, the runaway mate and the king she'd abandoned. Then Darius moved, vaulting over the battlements with inhuman grace, landing in the courtyard below, shoving through the crowd toward her. Rowan ran to meet him, her disguise forgotten, her fear forgotten, everything forgotten except the desperate need to warn him before it was too late. "Darius," she shouted, fighting through the press of bodies. "Darius, the wedding, it's a trap." He reached her in seconds, his hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Rowan," he breathed, and the raw emotion in his voice made her chest ache. But there was no time for reunions, no time for explanations. "The wedding," she gasped, clutching his arms. "Lady Cordelia's brother, he's hired assassins. They're going to strike during the ceremony. Darius, you can't marry her. You can't. Your Majesty." The beta appeared at Darius's side, his expression alarmed. "The ceremony is about to begin. Lady Cordelia is waiting at the altar." Darius's jaw clenched, his golden eyes searching Rowan's face. "You're certain?" "I overheard merchants talking. One had connections to the Northern Reaches Guard. Please, you have to believe me." For a heartbeat, she thought he'd dismiss her warning, send her away, choose the political marriage over the word of the girl who'd abandoned him. But then he nodded sharply. "Double the guards around the chapel. Search every guest. No one carries weapons inside. Your Majesty, the guests are already seated. Lady Cordelia, do it now," Darius commanded, then turned back to Rowan. "Come with me. Stay close." They moved through the fortress in a rush of guards and tension, reaching the grand chapel where hundreds of nobles had gathered. Lady Cordelia stood at the altar in a gown of white and silver, her beautiful face cold and composed. When her eyes landed on Rowan, something flickered, their recognition, perhaps, or hatred. The ceremony began, the priest's voice droning through the traditional vows. Darius stood rigid beside his bride, his attention split between the ritual and the guards searching the perimeter. Rowan watched from the shadows near the entrance, the moonstone burning hotter with each passing moment, the bond screaming at her that something was wrong, wrong, wrong. It happened during the exchange of rings. Lady Cordelia's hand moved to Darius's, and Rowan saw the glint of silver, a blade concealed in her sleeve, small but deadly, aimed at Darius's throat. "No!" Rowan launched herself forward, crashing into Darius and knocking him aside. The blade meant for his throat carved across his shoulder instead, and his roar of pain shook the chapel. Chaos erupted. Guards poured in from every entrance, but so did the assassins, dozens of them hidden among the noble guests, their weapons suddenly drawn. Lady Cordelia's beautiful mask cracked into something vicious. "Kill him! Kill them all!" Darius fought despite his wound, his movements predatory and precise, but there were too many assassins, and the blade had been poisoned. Rowan could see it in the way his movements began to slow, the way sweat beaded on his forehead. He was fighting the transformation, fighting to maintain his human form in front of his court, but the poison was forcing the change. "Darius!" she called out, dodging an assassin's blade and crawling toward him through the chaos. "Let it happen. Let the beast come. They'll see," he gritted out, his voice already deepening, bones beginning to crack. "They'll know what I am, what I've always been. I don't care." Rowan reached him as his form began to shift, as fur rippled across his skin and his face elongated into that familiar muzzle. "I don't care what they see. I choose you, beast and king, both forms, all of you." The transformation completed in a rush of power that sent assassins flying backward. The beast rose to his full height, massive and terrifying, and the chapel fell silent with shock and fear. But Rowan didn't run. She stood and walked to him, her hands trembling but her resolve absolute. "I choose you," she repeated, reaching up to touch his monstrous face. "Now and forever. I accept the bond. I accept you." The moonstone exploded with light. Power surged through the chapel, through the bond, through both of them with such force that Rowan gasped. The beast threw back his head and roared. But this time it wasn't pain, it was triumph. It was release. It was a curse breaking under the weight of finally being chosen, being loved, being accepted for exactly what he was. Magic crackled through the air like lightning. The beast's form shimmered, shifted, but not into Darius's human shape. Instead, he stood between forms, still powerful, still fierce, but no longer trapped in either shape. The curse that had forced him to be beast at night and man by day shattered like glass, and when the light faded, Darius stood before her, fully human, fully himself, fully free. He stared at his hands in wonder, then at Rowan. "You broke it," he whispered. "The curse, you broke it. I chose you," she said simply. "Both of you, all of you." Around them, the remaining assassins were being subdued by guards. Lady Cordelia was in chains, her plot exposed, her ambition crushed. But Rowan barely noticed. She was too focused on Darius, on the way he was looking at her like she'd just given him back his soul. "I'm sorry," he said, pulling her close despite the wound still bleeding on his shoulder. "For not telling you the truth. For making you think it was a game. I was afraid you'd only love one half of me. Afraid you'd choose the beast over the king or the king over the beast. I needed to know you could love all of me." "I do," Rowan said, tears streaming down her face. "I love the king who sees through my masks, and the beast who listens to my voice. I love you, Darius Fenwick. Curse and all." He kissed her then, in front of his entire court, in front of the ruined wedding and the captured assassins, in front of everyone who'd ever called her worthless. And when he pulled back, his golden eyes were wet. "My queen," he said. "My mate. My Rowan." "Yours," she agreed. "Now and forever." 3 months later, Rowan stood before the mirror in the royal chambers, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. Gone was the frightened girl in a thin shift, who'd been dragged to the obsidian fortress as payment for a debt. In her place stood a queen, draped in midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver wolves, the moonstone necklace gleaming at her throat, her crown delicate and fierce, wrought from the same silver as the necklace rested on her white blonde hair like it had always belonged there. "You're stalling," Darius said from the doorway, his voice warm with amusement. He looked magnificent in his formal black and silver, his own crown catching the light. But it was his eyes that held her, those golden eyes that had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. "I'm preparing," Rowan corrected, but her smile gave her away. "There's a difference. The court is waiting to see their new queen officially crowned." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both gazed at their reflection. "Though, between you and me, you've been their queen since the moment you chose a monster over safety." "I chose my mate," she corrected, leaning back against his chest. "There's a difference." The coronation was everything Rowan had never dared dream of. The great hall overflowed with nobles and common folk alike, all gathered to witness the impossible, a wolfless girl becoming queen of the Lycans. There were whispers, of course. There would always be whispers. But when Darius placed the crown on her head and declared her his queen and fated mate before the assembled kingdom, the applause drowned out every doubt. The celebration lasted well into the night, but there was one piece of business Darius had insisted on handling publicly. As the feast reached its height, guards brought forward 2 prisoners in chains, Garrick and Rowan Everhart, looking small and terrified in the grandeur of the hall. Rowan's hand tightened on her throne's armrest, but Darius's fingers found hers, steady and reassuring. "Garrick Everhart," Darius's voice rang out, silencing the hall. "You sold your daughter to settle your debts. You called her worthless, defective, a burden to your family. You traded her life for your own comfort." Garrick fell to his knees, his face pale. "Your Majesty, please, I didn't know. I had no idea she was your fated mate." "If I had known, that's precisely the point," Rowan said, her voice clear and strong despite the old wounds reopening. "You didn't know my worth because you never bothered to look. You measured me by what I couldn't do rather than who I was." Evelyn's face crumpled. "Rowan, please, we're your parents. We raised you. You kept me alive," Rowan interrupted, standing from her throne. "That's not the same as raising me. That's not the same as loving me." She descended the steps until she stood before them, no longer the frightened girl but a queen in her own right. "You taught me that family is conditional, that love is something you have to earn and can never quite achieve. But you were wrong." She turned to look at Darius, at the court that had accepted her, at the kingdom she now helped rule. "Real family chooses you. Real love accepts you as you are. And real worth isn't measured by what you can give others, but by who you choose to become." "The sentence," Darius said, his voice formal but his eyes soft when they met Rowan's, "is imprisonment in the Eastern Tower. You will live, Garrick and Rowan Everhart, but you will live knowing that the daughter you called worthless became the most powerful woman in the kingdom, and you will have nothing but time to regret the choice you made." Garrick opened his mouth to protest, but the guards were already dragging them away. Rowan watched them go and felt nothing but a distant sort of pity. They would never understand what they'd lost. They would spend the rest of their lives in that tower, comfortable enough but forever removed from the family they'd traded away. She returned to her throne, to Darius's side, and let the celebration continue around her. Justice had been served, not through cruelty but through consequence, and that was enough. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, Darius held her as she finally allowed herself to cry not for her parents, but for the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed she was unworthy of love. That girl deserved to be mourned before she could be fully laid to rest. "I have news," Rowan said when her tears had dried, her hand drifting to her stomach. "The healers confirmed it this morning." Darius went very still. "Rowan? I'm pregnant," she whispered, and watched joy transform his face into something almost too beautiful to witness. "The bond, it's fulfilled, its promise. We're going to have a child." He pulled her close, his hand covering hers over her stomach, and Rowan felt the bond pulse between them, stronger now, deeper, intertwined with the new life growing inside her, a child who would be loved unconditionally, a child who would never doubt their worth, a child born of a bond that had survived betrayal and fear, and a curse that had lasted generations. "My queen," Darius murmured against her hair. "My mate, my Rowan, my king," she replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. "My beast, my Darius." They'd both been broken in different ways, him by a curse that split his soul, her by a family that measured her worth in what she lacked. But together, they were whole. Together, they were exactly enough. And in the tower where she'd once waited to be devoured by a monster, Rowan had found something she'd stopped believing in. A home where she was wanted, a love that was unconditional, and a future that was finally, blessedly, hers to claim. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.